Imagine a world where an invisible enemy arrives unannounced, leaving a trail of devastation that reshapes continents and alters the course of human history forever. This isn't the plot of a disaster movie. This was the grim reality of the mid-14th century. We're talking about the Black Death, one of the most catastrophic pandemics in recorded history, between 1347 and 1351. This relentless plague swept across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, wiping out an estimated 75 to 200 million people. To put that in perspective, it's like the entire population of modern-day Brazil simply vanishing. In Europe alone, it's believed that up to 60% of the population perished. So, what was this terrifying disease? Where did it come from? And how did its survivors manage to rebuild a world from the ashes of the old one? Let's journey back in time to uncover the chilling story of the Black Death. Our story begins not in Europe, but thousands of miles away, on the arid steppes of Central Asia. This region was a natural reservoir for a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, the true culprit behind the plague. For centuries, this bacterium lived relatively harmlessly among wild rodent populations, like Mark. But around the 1330s, something changed. Climate shifts or other ecological factors might have forced these rodents out of their natural habitats and into closer contact with humans and their livestock. The bacterium found a new, highly effective carrier: the black rat, and more specifically, the fleas that lived on them. These rats were expert travelers, hitching rides on merchant caravans and ships, and they were about to embark on the deadliest journey in history. The vehicle for this global catastrophe was the legendary Silk Road, the network of trade routes connecting the East and West. As merchants, soldiers, and travelers moved goods like silk and spices, they unknowingly transported the plague-infested rats and fleas along with them. By the 1340s, the plague had reached the Crimea, a bustling hub of trade on the Black Sea. It was here, at the Genoese trading post of Kaffa, that the Black Death made its dramatic and horrifying entrance into Europe. Legend has it that during a siege in 1347, the Mongol army, who were already suffering from the plague, catapulted infected corpses over the city walls. This act of early biological warfare is debated by historians, but the outcome was the same. The disease was now inside Kaffa, fleeing the besieged city. Genoese merchants boarded their ships and set sail for home, unknowingly carrying the plague with them. In October 1347, 12 of these death ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. The people of Messina who gathered at the port were met with a horrific sight. Most of the sailors aboard were already dead or gravely ill, covered in mysterious black boils that oozed blood and pus. These boils, called buboes, gave the disease its other name: the bubonic plague. The Sicilian authorities hastily ordered the ships out of the harbor, but it was too late. The rats had already scurried ashore, and the plague had begun its relentless march across Europe. From Sicily, it spread to the Italian mainland, hitting major cities like Genoa and Venice with brutal force. By January 1348, it had reached Marseille in France. From these major ports, it radiated outwards, traveling along trade routes, rivers, and pilgrimage trails. The speed at which the plague spread was terrifying. It wasn't just the bubonic form, transmitted by flea bites. There were two other, even deadlier, variations. The septicemic plague occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, causing death within hours, often before any symptoms could even appear. And the most feared of all was the pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs and spread from person to person through coughing and airborne droplets. Much like a common cold, but with near 100% mortality. This meant you could catch the plague just by talking to an infected person. In a world with no understanding of germ theory, the disease seemed like a supernatural force, an inescapable judgment from God. Life in a plague-stricken city was a living nightmare. Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence, wrote a vivid account in his book. He described how people would eat lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors in paradise. The sick were abandoned by their families, who were terrified of catching the disease. Doctors, priests, and gravediggers who tended to the sick and dying were often the first to fall victim themselves. The social fabric completely disintegrated. Laws and customs were ignored, People locked themselves in their homes, hoping to wait out the storm, while others indulged in wild hedonistic parties, believing their days were numbered anyway. The streets were filled with the dead and dying. Mass graves were dug, but they quickly overflowed. In many places, the dead were simply left in their houses or piled up in the streets. The stench of death was everywhere. In the face of such overwhelming and inexplicable death, people desperately searched for an explanation. The most common belief was that the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. This led to a surge in religious fervor. Processions of flagellants roamed the countryside, publicly whipping themselves to atone for their sins and appease God's wrath. Others looked for earthly scapegoats. With no scientific knowledge of bacteria or viruses, they blamed poisoned wells, strange alignments of planets, or bad air, known as miasma. Tragically, this search for blame led to horrific persecution. Jewish communities. Europe were falsely accused of intentionally spreading the disease and were massacred in brutal thousands were burned alive or tortured, despite the fact that Jewish people were dying from the plague at the same rate as everyone else. By 1351, the first and most devastating wave of the Black Death began to recede, but it left behind a profoundly changed world. The sheer scale of the death toll was staggering. Europe's population wouldn't recover to its pre-plague levels for over 200 years. This massive depopulation, however, had some unexpected and revolutionary consequences. With so many workers gone, the old feudal system, which tied peasants to the land, began to crumble. There was a severe labor shortage, which meant for the first time, surviving peasants and laborers were in a position of power. They could demand higher wages, better working conditions, and more freedom. Many left their rural manors to seek new opportunities in the cities. This shift in power dynamics led to social unrest, like the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, but it also paved the way for the end of serfdom and the rise of a new middle class. The economic and social upheaval was immense. Entire villages were abandoned and fell into ruin. Vast areas of farmland returned to wilderness, but this disruption also sparked innovation. With labor now expensive, landowners and entrepreneurs had to find more efficient ways to do things, leading to new agricultural techniques and labor-saving technologies. The psychological impact was just as deep. The constant presence of death created a morbid fascination that was reflected in the art and literature of the time. The theme of Danse Macabre, or the Dance of Death, became popular, depicting skeletons, leading people from all walks of life, popes, kings, peasants to their graves. A stark reminder that death is the great equalizer. At the same time, the failure of the church to explain or stop the plague led many to question its authority, planting some of the first seeds of skepticism that would eventually blossom into the Reformation and the Renaissance. The Black Death was not a one-time event. It returned in subsequent waves every few decades for the next 300 years, though none were as devastating as the first. The Great Plague of London in 1665 was one of its last major appearances in Europe. The world learned, slowly and painfully, how to deal with epidemics. The city of Ragusa, was the first to implement a mandatory 30-day isolation period for arriving ships and travelers in 1377, a practice they called Trentino. This was later extended to 40 days, or quarantino, from which we get our modern word quarantine. This was the birth of public health policy. Today, thanks to antibiotics, the plague is treatable, but the story of the Black Death serves as a powerful and humbling reminder of the fragility of human civilization in the face of disease. It shows us how a tiny, invisible organism can bring empires to their knees and completely reshape the world. It's a chapter of history written in loss and sorrow, but also one that speaks to the incredible resilience of humanity and our ability to rebuild, adapt, and ultimately move forward. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey into the past fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most impactful events. And let us know in the comments what historical topic you'd like us to explore next. See you in the next video.